as the pivot of contemporary American history. That includes Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, right?
Well, I would be one of the first to confess that I think that we have misunderstood and underestimated President Carter. He was the one president of our time who recognized, I think, the challenges awaiting us if we refuse to get our house in order.
You're the only author I have read since I read Jimmy Carter who gives so much time to the president's speech on July 15th, 1979. Why does that speech speak to you so strongly?
Well, this is the so-called malaise speech, even though he never used the word malaise in the text of the address. It's a very powerful speech, I think, because President Carter says in that speech, oil, our dependence on oil, poses a looming threat to the country. If we act now, we may be able to fix this problem. If we don't act now, we're headed on a path in which not only will we become increasingly dependent upon foreign oil, but we will have opted for a false model of freedom, a freedom of materialism, a freedom of self-indulgence, a freedom of collective recklessness. And what the president was saying at the time was, we need to think about what we mean by freedom. We need to choose a definition of freedom which is anchored in truth, and the way to manifest that choice is by addressing our energy problem. He had a profound understanding of the dilemma facing the country in the post-Vietnam period. And of course, he was completely hooted, derided, disregarded.
And he lost the election. You, in fact, say that this speech killed any chance he had of winning re-election. Why? Because the American people didn't want to settle for less?
They absolutely did not. And indeed, the election of 1980 was the great expression of that, because in 1980 we have a candidate, perhaps the most skillful politician of our time, Ronald Reagan, who says that doomsayers, gloomsayers, don't listen to them. The country's best days are ahead of us.
Morning in America.
It's morning in America. And you don't have to sacrifice. You can have more. All we need to do is get government out of the way and drill more holes for oil, because the president led us to believe the supply of oil was infinite.
You describe Ronald Reagan as the modern prophet of profligacy, the politician who gave moral sanction to the empire of consumption.
Well, to understand the truth about President Reagan is to understand why so much of what we imagine to be our politics is misleading and false. He was the guy who came in and said, we need to shrink the size of government. Government didn't shrink during the Reagan era, it grew. He came in and he said, we need to reduce the level of federal spending. He didn't reduce it. It went through the roof, and the budget deficits for his time were the greatest they had been since World War II.
And do you remember that it was his successor, his vice president, the first President Bush, who said in 1992, the American way of life is not negotiable.
And all presidents, again, this is not a Republican thing or a Democratic thing, all presidents, all administrations are committed to that proposition. Now, I would say that probably 90% of the American people today would concur. The American way of life is not up for negotiation.
And
what I would invite them to consider is that if you want to preserve that which you value most in the American way of life, and of course you need to ask yourself, what is it that you value most? But if you want to preserve that which you value most in the American way of life, then we need to change the American way of life. We need to modify that which may be peripheral in order to preserve that which is at the center of what we value.
What do you value most?
Well, I think the clearest statement of what I value is found in the preamble to the Constitution. There is nothing in the preamble to the Constitution which defines the purpose of the United States of America as remaking the world in our image, which I view as a fool's errand. There is nothing in the preamble of the Constitution that ever imagined that we would embark upon an effort, as President Bush has defined it, to transform the greater Middle East, this region of the world that incorporates something on the order of 1.4 billion people. I believe that the framers of the Constitution were primarily concerned with focusing on the way we live here, the way we order our affairs, to try to ensure that as individuals we can have an opportunity to pursue our perhaps differing definitions of freedom, but also so that as a community we could live together in some kind of harmony, and that future generations would also be able to share in those same opportunities. The big problem, it seems to me, with the current crisis in American foreign policy is that unless we do change our ways, the likelihood that our children, our grandchildren, the next generation is going to enjoy the opportunities that we've had is very slight, because we are squandering our power. We are squandering our wealth. In many respects, to the extent that we persist in our imperial delusions, we're also going to squander our freedom, because imperial policies, which end up enhancing the authority of the imperial president, also end up providing imperial presidents with an opportunity to compromise freedom even here at home. And we've seen that since 9/11.
The disturbing thing that you say again and again in here is that every president since Reagan has relied on military power to conceal or manage these problems that stem from the nation's habits of profligacy, right?
That's exactly right. And again, I think this is another issue where one needs to be unsparing in fixing responsibility as much on liberal Democratic presidents as conservative Republican ones. I think that the Bush administration's response to 9/11 in constructing this paradigm of a global war on terror, in promulgating the so-called Bush doctrine of preventive war, in plunging into Iraq, an utterly unnecessary war, will go down in our history as a record of recklessness that will be probably unmatched by any other administration. But it doesn't really mean that Bill Clinton before him, or George Herbert Walker Bush before him, or Ronald Reagan before him were all that much better. Because they all have seen military power as our strong suit. They all have worked on the assumption that through the projection of power or the threat to employ power, that we can fix the world in order to sustain this dysfunctional way of life that we have back here.